I never expected her to remember my name, let alone everything else. It was 9:10, and the diner near the edge of town was quiet except for the hum of the neon sign outside. I sat in the corner booth, hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee, staring at the condensation forming along its sides. I wasn't in a rush. I never really am, not anymore. Most nights I just pause, let my thoughts drift somewhere I shouldn't. She appeared in the doorway, like she always did. Almost casually, almost effortlessly. My friend's mom, Lisa, mid-40s, maybe early 50s, with that habit of tucking her hair behind one ear when she was thinking. Something about the way she carried herself made the diner feel smaller, quieter, more possible. "Hey, David," she said, and that was it. Nothing in her tone that hinted at more than a hello. But it was enough. Enough to make my chest tighten without me really knowing why. I watched her scan the diner like she always does. Then she noticed me, and her lips curved slightly. She slid into the booth across from me without asking. "You're still on the black coffee?" she asked, eyes flicking toward the cup. "Yeah," I said, surprised she remembered. My stomach did a little flip, though I tried to hide it. I folded the napkin under my hand, watching the edges crumple. "Thought you might have upgraded by now," she said, smirking faintly, like she knew something I didn't. I shrugged. Change isn't really my thing. There was a pause. One of those silences that hums with meaning if you pay attention. She stirred her coffee slowly, almost lazily, her fingers brushing the spoon against the cup, and I caught myself staring. Not in the obvious way, not like some teenager ogling a poster. I just noticed her, the small gestures, the quiet rhythm she carried around her. "You're late," I said finally, because that's all I could think to say. "Traffic," she muttered. Her gaze met mine for a beat longer than it needed to. A shared joke that wasn't a joke. Something fragile and light and impossible to define. I took a sip of my coffee, burned my tongue slightly, and pretended not to wince. I liked the way she didn't rush me, like she understood that everything about me was slow, hesitant, and a little messy. I realized, not for the first time, that this was probably the only place where I felt seen. We didn't talk much after that. She fiddled with her thermos, flipping in her hands, and I traced the rim of my cup, watching the condensation slide down like time itself was slow and deliberate. I had an unsent text still sitting in my phone from hours ago, a half-thought that I deleted because it felt too heavy. My loneliness wasn't loud. It was the quiet, everyday kind, the one that lives in small habits and missed opportunities. She probably didn't know, wouldn't guess. That was the point. When she finally stood, her bag sliding over her shoulder, she looked at me in a way that lingered just a moment too long. "See you tomorrow," she asked. Not a question exactly, more like a possibility. I nodded, even though I had no idea if I wanted tomorrow or if tomorrow wanted me. I watched her leave, her heels clicking softly on the linoleum. And then my phone buzzed. I hadn't checked it, hadn't wanted to. The message preview was brief. "I can't stop thinking about tonight." I didn't know whether to laugh or panic. Or maybe both. I stared at it for a long time. Folded the napkin again. Looked toward the door she had vanished through. And then I realized I had no idea what I was getting into. I ran into her again a few days later at the bookstore near the edge of town. She was crouched between the shelves, flipping through old cookbooks, hair loose this time, falling just past her shoulders. She looked up when I approached, startled, then smiled like she had no choice but to forgive me for existing. "David," she said, voice softer than the diner. "I didn't expect you here. Thought I'd browse," I said, trying not to sound like I had a plan. I followed her slowly down the aisle, noticing the way her fingers lingered on the spines of the books. She pulled one out, dust motes floating in the sunlight through the high windows. "My mother gave me this one when I moved out," she said. "I never learned half the recipes, but it reminds me of her, I guess." She glanced at me and laughed quietly. I burn a lot of things, though. Mostly toast. I laughed too, though it was quiet, hesitant. I liked that she shared that, even if it was small, even if it wasn't profound. She didn't owe me anything, but she let me in, if just a little. "Sounds like we get along in the kitchen," I said, imagining myself failing miserably at pancakes under her supervision. She flicked her eyes toward mine, a little spark of humor there, a little pause that felt like more than words. We drifted to the cafe corner of the store, both of us pretending to browse while actually watching each other. I noticed the way her hands curled around the warm mug she carried, how her shoulders relaxed when no one was looking. I had my own coffee, barely sipped, but it felt like we were sharing it somehow, across the air. "You're younger than I thought," she said finally. Not a judgment, just an observation. 23, I admitted. "You already knew that." She tilted her head, expression unreadable. "Doesn't matter. Just different rhythms. You're still figuring out your mornings, your evenings. Me, I've got a history." She paused, eyes scanning the table between us. Divorced, empty nest, all that. I swallowed. There was the risk, the boundary I knew I shouldn't cross. She was my friend's mother, for God's sake. But I could feel it in the quiet way her gaze met mine, like an unspoken challenge, a question neither of us could answer aloud. I imagined scenarios I shouldn't, her laughing at something I said late at night, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, letting me hold her hand accidentally. And then I chastised myself for thinking it. Still, the tension settled into the small spaces between us. I helped her pick a cookbook from a lower shelf. Our fingers brushed, just lightly, but it lingered. Her gaze caught mine, soft, unflinching, and I felt a shiver of recognition. I don't know why that moment stayed with me. I thought as she turned to leave, her bag resting against her hip, maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. She smiled over her shoulder, a little playful, a little sad, and I nodded. I wanted to say more, but I didn't. Instead, I watched her go, lingering a beat longer than propriety would allow. And then, as she disappeared around the corner, she turned and flicked her eyes at me again. Just a spark, just a whisper of something that might have been, and maybe, just maybe, was enough. The rain started just as I was leaving my part-time job, small drops at first, tapping the hood of my jacket. I ducked under the awning of her apartment building, hoping she wasn't coming or going, but of course she was carrying groceries in one hand, keys dangling from the other. "David," she said, a little startled but not annoyed. I watched her balance the bags, one strap slipping from her shoulder, and I stepped forward before I could stop myself. "Let me help," I said, grabbing the heavier bag. Our hands brushed again, fingers grazing, and she froze for a second, just a flicker, but enough. I can manage," she said, voice light, but I sensed hesitation, a subtle pullback. Something in her posture tightened, shoulders rolling forward as if she could shrink from the moment entirely. We walked up the stairwell together, quiet except for the drip of rainwater from her coat onto the floor. I wanted to say something, anything, but my words caught halfway. I watched her glance at me once, eyes soft but wary. "You're busy later?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She shook her head. "No, just catching up on some things." And that was it. No invitation, no complaint, just the careful pause in her tone. I noticed it immediately, the invisible line she'd drawn between us. In the apartment, she put the groceries down on the counter. I offered to help, but she waved me off, busy unpacking, folding a bag of vegetables into the fridge. I lingered, hands stuffed in my pockets, watching the way she moved. The smell of her shampoo, the faint clatter of cans in the cupboard. It was quiet intimacy, the kind that builds in the edges. "Careful with that," she said, lifting a jar, and for a second, our fingers met on the lid. We held it there too long, just a second too long. I could feel her pulse under my touch, or maybe it was mine racing. The moment stretched. I imagined leaning closer, just a little, close enough to hear her breath shift, close enough that it might be something. A laugh echoed from the other room. My friend's little brother, visiting, probably curious, unaware. Her eyes darted toward the sound, a sharp reminder of the world outside our suspended space. She stepped back, smoothing her hair, giving me a small, almost apologetic smile. "Sorry," she said, soft, like she hadn't meant to pull the moment away, but had no choice. I nodded, swallowing. My chest was tight. Words would have been useless anyway. We moved around each other like dancers, close but careful, synchronized but hesitant. Then, as she reached for a cup on the counter, Our faces came dangerously close. I could feel the warmth of her breath, a heartbeat away from everything I'd imagined. My eyes flicked down for a split second, and when I looked up, she was looking right at me, and for a moment, it was almost undeniable. I didn't move. She didn't move. And then, footsteps outside, a knock on the door, and the moment shattered into the mundane. We blinked at each other, half smiles, and the tension collapsed into silence. I left before she could say anything more, rain soaking the collar of my jacket, but the memory of that near touch stayed with me. I saw her sitting on the park bench when I walked off the bus, hood pulled low, hands wrapped around a paper cup. The late afternoon light filtered through bare branches, dusting her hair with gold. She didn't look up at first, just rocked slightly in place like she was trying to keep herself steady. I sat down beside her, careful not to touch. The bench groaned under both our weight. Silence stretched long enough for the cold to sink into my sleeves. "You're early," she said finally, voice almost too soft to hear. I just wanted to see you," I admitted, not looking at her. My words felt clumsy, too heavy for the quiet. She huffed a laugh, small and brittle. "You always want to see me." There was no accusation, just a tremor of tension, something fragile. I shifted on the bench. "It's not like that." I started but stopped. I wasn't sure what that was anymore. She turned toward me slowly, eyes catching mine. "Is it?" she whispered. Her fingers brushed the rim of her cup, then paused. The gesture was casual, but felt deliberate. I felt the twist in my chest. Jealousy, guilt, both. I didn't have words, just the raw pull of wanting her close and knowing I shouldn't. "I saw your son yesterday," I said, voice low. My throat tightened. "He was with his friends." I stopped. What was I even saying? She smiled faintly, not quite comforting. "You saw him, and I felt like maybe I shouldn't be here. Like maybe this." I gestured vaguely between us. "This is all wrong." Her gaze softened, then hardened, then softened again. "David," she paused, letting the sound of my name linger. "Do you ever wonder what it'd be like if we didn't have to be careful?" The question hung between us, a fragile bridge over something neither of us wanted to name. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to say every forbidden thing I'd imagined in quiet moments, but the words stuck in my chest. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, shifting closer, and I caught the faint scent of her shampoo. My hands itched to reach out, but I didn't. Not yet. Not while the bench felt like a world collapsing in tiny increments. "I can't," she began, voice breaking slightly, then stopped. She stared at her cup, at the fading light, at the space between us, and I realized she was unraveling too, the quiet tension of months finally pressing against her carefully drawn lines. I wanted to lean closer, just a little, close enough to hear her heartbeat, close enough to let her know I felt it too. But I hesitated, frozen by the possibility of crossing something irreversible. The wind picked up, and the last leaves of autumn scattered across the path. She looked up at me, eyes wide, searching, and then she asked, without words, the question that would change everything if I answered. Would I step closer or step back? I didn't see her for almost a week. Not at the diner, not at the bookstore, not even in the park where we always met. I told myself it was coincidence at first, but the silence grew heavy. I kept checking my phone, half expecting a text, half fearing one. Each empty screen felt like a small betrayal, though I had no right to feel betrayed. She hadn't done anything wrong. Or had she? I couldn't tell anymore. Then I ran into her briefly at the grocery store. She smiled, polite but distant, eyes flicking past me like I was a stranger in a crowd. She didn't stop, didn't wave. I wanted to chase her down, to ask what changed, but my legs froze at the end of the aisle. Later, at the diner, I sat in our booth, black coffee cooling in front of me. I watched the door, half hoping she'd walk in, half hoping she wouldn't. I started imagining reasons. An ex she hadn't mentioned. Trouble with her son. Work stress I didn't know about. Maybe she realized this, us, was too dangerous. Too complicated. I texted her once. "Hey, everything okay?" Nothing. I stared at the little typing bubble that never appeared, then deleted the message. Tried again the next day. Still nothing. The quiet was worse than any argument could have been. I felt it pressing into my chest, a slow weight that made my usual routines feel hollow. I walked past her apartment on the off chance she'd be on the balcony, coffee in hand, like she sometimes was. Nothing. Empty windows. I found myself replaying the last time we'd been close, on the park bench, the almost confession hanging between us. I wondered if she regretted it, if she had second thoughts, if maybe I'd misread everything. And yet, part of me couldn't stop imagining her small gestures, the way she'd brush her hair behind her ear, the soft curve of her smile in low light. The memory felt sharp, bittersweet, like a wound that refused to heal. I want to knock on her door, to show up at the bookstore, to say something, anything. But I didn't. Not yet. Not while the silence had its own power, shaping the space between us. I left a seat empty at the diner that night, my coffee untouched, the napkin folded just so. I stared out the window at the street, the rain softening the neon glow. And in that quiet, I realized I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused, like life forgot to finish the sentence. I thought about texting her again, rehearsing every word in my head, then letting it sit unsent. I imagined her reading it, imagining me wondering, but the phone stayed in my pocket. I left the diner, stepping into the damp night, and the empty booth lingered behind me, waiting. Maybe I found her in the kitchen that evening, early twilight spilling through the blinds. She was chopping onions, methodical, silent, the soft scrape of the knife against the cutting board filling the space between us. I lingered in the doorway, hands shoved deep in my pockets, unsure if I had the right to be here. She didn't look up. "You're here," she said. Not a question, not a welcome, just observation. I said, voice tight. My chest felt like it might split if I didn't speak. "I can't keep waiting in the dark." She set the knife down and wiped her hands on a towel. The movement was small, precise, but somehow vulnerable. Her eyes met mine finally, holding for a long beat. "And what do you want me to do?" I stepped closer, careful, unsure. I don't know, to say it, to not leave it unsaid anymore. My hands fidgeted, twisting together in front of me. She leaning against the counter, arms crossed loosely. All of this, she said, voice soft, a little fractured. "It's complicated." And she stopped, bit her lip, eyes flicking to the knife still on the board. "I don't know if I can risk it." I swallowed hard. "I don't expect certainty. I don't expect anything. I needed you to know." There was a pause, heavy, charged. The air smelled faintly of onions and something warmer, more intimate. I noticed the way her shoulders tensed, the flicker of doubt in her eyes. And yet, there was something else, something raw, something quietly human. She was considering it, just for a second, just enough to make me hope. "I've been thinking about it too," she admitted finally. "All the almosts, all the what-ifs." Her voice dropped, almost a whisper. "But I've been afraid of losing control, of making a mistake." "I know," I said. My fingers itched to reach for hers, to close the distance in a way that didn't need words. "We'll take it slow. No mistakes. No expectations." She studied me, tilting her head, as if measuring how dangerous honesty could be. And then, finally, she nodded. Not a full surrender, not a dramatic declaration, just acknowledgement. Just letting something fragile exist without shattering. I exhaled. A weight lifted, though not all of it. Some pieces remained uncertain, unspoken. But in that tiny kitchen, in the failing light, it was enough. She reached over and brushed a stray strand of hair behind my ear, lightly, like it might vanish if I blinked. I didn't pull back, didn't move forward. "Just let it be." "Okay," she said softly, a little laugh in her voice. Not a promise, not an ending, just okay. I nodded, and that was enough. We stood there in quiet, sharing space, sharing the tension of months distilled into a single, unspoken understanding. And for the first time, it felt like being seen didn't hurt. It was 8:47 in the morning when I finally saw her again at the diner. Black coffee, exactly how she liked it, steam curling in the cool light. I slid into the booth across from her, careful not to make a sound. "Morning," she said, folding the napkin beside her cup. Her hair fell loose over one shoulder, just like the first time I really noticed her. No grand declarations. No trembling confessions. Just her. "Morning," I said. I paused, watched her take a small sip, the way her lips pressed briefly to the rim. That quiet rhythm, the little things I'd memorized, was enough to make my chest settle. Weeks had passed since the kitchen conversation. We hadn't rushed anything. Sometimes we went days without seeing each other, sometimes hours, sometimes minutes that felt like all the time in the world. We had learned to exist in each other's space without needing to define it, to let ordinary routines carry the weight of extraordinary feeling. We talked about mundane things, groceries, the rain, a friend's birthday. Shared tea in the afternoon, folded napkins without noticing, laughed quietly at jokes that weren't funny to anyone else. She handed me a thermos once, just like she had months ago, and the gesture felt intimate in a way words never could. I watched her hands, the way they brushed against the table when she laughed, the way she stirred her coffee slowly, deliberately. I realized I'd been waiting for something monumental to happen, when all along the quiet, everyday moments were enough. Later, we walked past the park bench where we had almost crossed the line, now empty and sunlit. She stopped, glanced down at the spot, and shrugged faintly. "Seems smaller than I remember," she said. "Or maybe we're bigger," I said. She smiled, soft, private, and I understood. Bigger than the mistakes, the hesitations, the boundaries we'd tiptoed around. Bigger because we'd survived them together. Life wasn't perfect. There were still mornings when her son needed her. Nights when I was too tired to visit. Days when the world demanded attention neither of us could give to each other. But somehow it was warmer. Somehow it was steady. We sat at the counter later, sharing a single black coffee between us, elbows brushing, and didn't speak much. Words weren't necessary. The silence had grown comfortable, layered with everything we'd been through. As she looked out the window, sunlight catching the curve of her jaw, I realized I knew her in a way no one else did. And I think she knew me too. Not fully, not perfectly, but enough. The bell over the door jingled faintly, and I glanced up, half expecting someone to interrupt the quiet we'd built. But it was just the world moving on. I folded the napkin under my hand, watched the steam rise from the cup. A private rhythm, our little marker in the ordinary day. And I thought, softly, almost to myself, we ended up here. Not a story anyone else would understand, but we did. She glanced at me, a little smile tugging at her lips, and I returned it. That was enough. That was everything.